Game of Thrones, I feel, is a big metaphor there. It's turned into the most popular show on the planet, and the story it's telling are separateness and all these kings and queens fighting for power. Then this threat comes. The only way to overcome the threat is they have to come together and collaborate. And I love that. When I was off at the park, somebody said, you want to look at the blogs coming up, because they were talking, who's going to be cast as Bronn? It's Jerome Flynn. One guy said, this is the worst day of my life. And it was quite hurtful. I think it's that impression that I'd given, you know, singing old pop songs with Robson.
The biggest cause of death for guys under 35 is suicide.
I know indirectly and directly 4 or 5 young men in the last couple of years. From one point of view, you can understand why it would be, because the rest don't look so good, you know. Our system, it needs a big, big change. And we're the ones, that's up to what, because it ain't going to do it by itself. When enough of a percentage of the population gather together to make change, there's a tipping point. What is more important than the health and well-being of our young people now, given, like you said, the responsibility that they have and what they're walking into and the resilience they're going to need? You know, real solid grounding in themselves, an understanding of their own true nature. That's where our true power comes from. It's not from the, I'm not saying but it's not from the O-levels and A-levels that we pick up and the qualifications. We know, well, that's been proved. You know, that why are there more young men killing themselves now than... it's not because they're not it's not because of that type of education.
Yeah, it's a different type, yeah. Because I think is the stat, guys under the age of 35, the biggest threat to themselves is themselves. In terms of the biggest cause of death for guys under 35 is suicide. Something like that. Stat.
I know indirectly and directly 4 or 5 young men in the last couple of years. And it's become, the scary thing is it's become kind of a viable choice, because it's in the, and 3 of those followed suit.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, that's an option.
Yeah, which is...
We're in a...
scary in itself.
We're in a culture where it's an option, and you can, from one point of view, if you haven't, it's like, if we're not, then you can understand why it would be, because the rest don't look so good, you know. So yeah, ultimately, our system, it needs a big, big change. And we're the ones, that's up to what, because it ain't going to do it by itself. We are it, and we're within it. So, you know, it's been proven in our past that when enough of a percentage of the population gather together to make change, there's a tipping point.
Yeah. And
we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah. I think it's definitely a slow process.
When I was off at the park.
Yeah.
So the people, obviously, the people that offered it me were the American writers and producers, Dan and David, who didn't know anything about my past here or my singing.
Okay, yeah.
So somebody had said, you know, when I got it, I didn't know anything about Game of Thrones, and somebody said, you want to look at the blogs coming up, Jerome. Somebody sent me something, and I didn't even know anything about blogs, but obviously there's fans of the books, and the English ones. Literally, but there was one guy that said, because they were talking, who's going to be cast as Bronn, blah, blah, and then it comes down to, it's Jerome Flynn, and one guy said, this is the worst day of my life. I was like, and it was quite hurtful. I think it's that impression that I'd given, you know, singing old pop songs with Robson. It was the last thing they could imagine that was Bronn of the Blackwater, you know, with my blonde hair and blue eyes and, you know.
Singing love songs.
Yeah, doing silly dances on the roof of New York building. So I hope I've kind of reclaimed some street cred. The Bronn's brought that back, but it was funny. That was literally it's a very sad day for quite a lot of people from what I could gather.
It's funny because having been such a big fan of it and seeing you as Bronn, in my mind, I'd built up an idea of who you were as well, because like you said, a lot of the times when you play a character, there's a little bit of that character in you as an actor, hence why you relate to the role sometimes, right? So I had this idea of like, okay, like he's going to be like this butch kind of, and even, you know, the role you played in John Wick 3 recently, it's like a kind of butch kind of alpha male kind of role.
Yeah.
But then as I was obviously like researching and doing some reading and reading previous interviews, and then we had that short phone call earlier, I was like, oh my God, this is not what I expected at all. This is like, but you know, I think that's kind of testament, isn't it, to like, the way you played the role, but how you can step into something like that and portray it the way it's meant to be portrayed, despite
not necessarily being like
that. Yeah.
It's one of the. That's why I love acting, though. It allows you to play out. You know, help me to play out those archetypes in myself. Like when I first started Bronn, and the first thing I had to do was there was an ambush, and I think I had to kill about 6 or 7 people. You know, with all machete, sword. Nothing like a woman after a fight. And I didn't. It's like when the camera rolled, I was like, it tapped into something very, you know, very primal. Within, given the situation I was in, I could really let loose. So I love that. No, and that's for me. That's the best. That's the best bit about acting is I think also all the meditation, all this experience that I've had, coming back to acting, if you like, I feel freer with it, and able to kind of treat it a bit like kind of a channeling, just tuning into those energies and those archetypes rather than like, and hopefully less self-conscious and just able to let that creativity flow. So yeah, no, it's been kind to me. It's funny with Game of Thrones because I feel there's a big metaphor there. You know, and when I took it, I was a bit worried. You know, I was a bit worried that I was getting involved with kind of something that was a bit kind of crappy American medieval history. I was like, oh God, fingers crossed. Didn't know how it was going to go. They wouldn't show us the script, I don't think, before we took. And yeah, it turned out to be this one, you know, this wonderful kind of exploration of the whole human condition. Everything we've been talking about is laid out, and it's turned into the most popular show on the planet. And the story it's telling is, like I say, it's like all this our separateness and all these families and kings and queens fighting for power, and then this threat comes, and they have the only way to overcome the threat is they have to come together and collaborate. And I love that. I love the fact that metaphor, and I mean, this is, maybe it's not, but the fact that a young northern girl was the one who got, you know, who took out the Night King.
Yeah.
I like that, the fact that, you know, with Greta Thunberg doing what she does, doing what she's doing, and having the effect she has, I can also draw that metaphor. But for the other one, I think it's perfect. And it's perfect that it has been such a popular story, because it's like we are drawn to our past and our history and the time when things were slightly more wild and the magic of it. And then it's like, oh my God, it's also an extraordinary allegory for our times.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, to say I was obsessed with it was probably a slight understatement. I was kind of the kind of person who after every episode would be on YouTube, you know, looking for the conspiracy theories and reading this and in the forums and having conversations with people. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I think, you know, some of the comparisons you just made there, and also just from what we were talking about earlier, when you think about the political side of things that we're speaking about, and then the environmental state of things, I think that was very much represented in the, you know, the Game of Thrones versus, you know, the threat coming from the north, and also you've got, you know, like the north trying to break away from the rest of, which could be, you know, us at the minute and Brexit and all those sorts of things. Yeah. But Was that the kind of feeling that you guys had whilst working on it, that there was a kind of representation of these modern times within the show, or is it something that in hindsight you look back on and go, actually, yeah, if you could tie these things together?
Certainly in terms of the human condition,
yeah,
and the present political condition, that way. It wasn't until kind of toward the end of and we were doing the last season, and with the climate crisis, because that's what I meant in terms of the metaphor, in terms of the White Walkers, winter is coming kind of thing. It wasn't till then, and then I started thinking, oh my God, and then I read an article with George, who wrote it, who said he didn't realise until, I think he was watching the second season, but I feel, and he didn't consciously, when he was writing, mean to be doing that. But I think there's it was going on in his, I think there was something going on in his subconscious there.